substance use, and HIV. My name is Grace Rowan, a graduate assistant at IHEC, and I'll be your moderator, along with Aisha, the assistant director for the Illinois Higher Education Center for Alcohol, Other Drug, and Violence Prevention, and we are very excited to be hosting today's event. Before I hand over the microphone, I have a few housekeeping items to cover about today's webinar and the GoToWebinar platform. For those of you new to using GoToWebinar, you will see the control panel on the right of your screen. This is where you'll find the question box that you can type and submit to at the end of the presentation. All attendees will be muted for today's program, but that does not mean you still can't participate. Please type your questions into the question box in the control panel. This will allow us to see your questions and we will address them. We will also send all PowerPoint slides following this presentation. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Nicholas Brady. Nicholas serves as a principal consultant of ChildWorks, which equips people with the tools and expertise to successfully address trauma in their respective systems. Nick graduated from the University of Illinois in Springfield with a bachelor's degree in clinical psychology and a master's degree in human services. Nick?
Yes, Grace, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, I just want to start by thanking Aisha and Grace today and the rest of the folks at IHEC for making this opportunity possible today for this presentation. So I'm grateful for that. To begin with, I want to orient our thinking for today's webinar. I hope by the end of today's webinar that you will have a new set of eyes, or if you will, a new set of glasses or lens through which you can see some of the work that you're doing. And that lens that I'm referring to is this trauma-informed lens. So recognizing all the people that you may be working with, all the college students, for instance, or your colleagues, to see them, their behaviors, their actions, their emotions, through this lens of the trauma-informed approach. Recognizing how they interact with you may be influenced by the trauma that they have experienced in their life. And so I want you to take that framework and to keep that in mind, put it in your pocket, if you will, as we go through today's presentation. And so in today's presentation, I would like to cover 3 specific learning objectives. One being to define psychological trauma, substance use, and HIV, just to give us a shared understanding of those 3 things. Also to begin to understand how trauma can feed into this idea of substance use and HIV acquisition and transmission, and then consider some campus and classroom strategies to address psychological trauma. And I know for many of you, you're primarily interested in substance use and violence prevention pieces, but I think HIV is a timely and relevant topic, and it connects quite well to this idea of trauma and how it can fuel substance use and how both of those trauma and substance use can fuel HIV. So something we'll just briefly cover today. So to begin, I'd just like to start with this psychological trauma definition, which is courtesy of SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Individual trauma results from an event, series of events or set of circumstances experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, with those lasting effects that we can see on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, etc. well-being. I want you to pay particular attention to the word experienced. This is something that is subjective. So in other words, my experience of event that may be potentially traumatizing may not be the same experience that Aisha, for example, might have of that event. And so in this way, one event could be traumatizing for me, and that same event may not be traumatizing for another person. So it's not necessarily the event itself that tells us whether or not trauma has occurred, but rather the experience that that individual has of a given event. So something, very important point to keep in mind. So why is trauma important? Why do we care about addressing trauma? One of the biggest reasons is the impact it can have on our psychological functioning, which has physiological underpinnings. So in English, I'm talking particularly about 2 portions of the brain that are impacted by trauma, although there are others beyond this, and that's part of the limbic system that we know as the amygdala. You can see pictured here on the screen, the amygdala right around in this area. And then also the prefrontal cortex, pictured on the other side of the screen, which helps us, for example, pay attention in today's webinar to be able to make judgments and behavioral decisions to regulate our emotional responses that we have through cognitive reasoning that occurs in the prefrontal cortex. When trauma happens, these two systems, portions of the brain can go awry. And so we know that studies have shown that the sizes of the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala have been shown to change in individuals who experience trauma, and also the connectivity between these two portions. And if you don't know, the amygdala is responsible for our instinctual mammalian response to fight, flight, or freeze in response to threats. So when the connectivity between the prefrontal cortex, which helps with our judgment and behavior, is diminished to the connectivity to the amygdala, then we can have a situation when trauma occurs that I can no longer turn off the fight, flight, or freeze. And that's something that can cause emotional dysregulation, the inability to effectively modulate and regulate our emotional responses, our responses to threats, whether they're real or just perceived threats. And we'll talk about why this is important later in terms of substance use and violence very briefly. The other important piece about traumatic events is this subset of trauma known as adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. And we know that ACEs, due to years of research, are correlated or associated, and perhaps some direct causal pathways, but at the very least associated with a whole host of negative health outcomes, risk-taking behaviors, and lower education, occupational income achievement, etc. And so what this ultimately culminates to is a shorter life expectancy for those who have experienced the highest levels of childhood traumatic experiences, known as adverse childhood experiences. So again, another reason why this topic is so important. But again, keeping in mind the emotional dysregulation that trauma at a young age especially can cause in an individual. And in a few moments, I'll talk about how that's connected to substance use. In terms of how prevalent trauma is, one of the best measures of psychological trauma is that adverse childhood experience, or that ACE score that individuals can have. It's essentially 10 different questions that measure the occurrence of these 10 specific types of events that may have occurred in a person's childhood, like child abuse, neglect, sexual abuse, or household dysfunction, being 3 or 4 broad categories. And while this ACE score is not a comprehensive and complete list of traumatic experiences, it's the best tool we have to measure early childhood adversity at this time. And so that's why a lot of people use these numbers. So here in Illinois, you can see on this pie chart, there are approximately 62% of individuals in Illinois that have experienced 1 or more adverse childhood experiences. And you can see it's broken down by 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 8. The other important point to note, that other slide I showed you with the adverse outcomes associated with ACEs, the higher your ACE score, the greater the likelihood you are to have more of those negative outcomes. So that there's a dose-response relationship is what you might refer that to in scientific terms. Okay, shifting our focus from this idea of trauma, creating emotional dysregulation, which fuels all these adverse outcomes, what about substance use and how might that be connected? So to begin that conversation, we just want to define substance use, and this definition that I use refers to any substance misuse, whether that's illicit or licit in terms of alcohol or illicit drugs, such as heroin, for example, which we hear about a lot in the media. But I'd also throw in tobacco as well as a substance that's misused, that often can be exacerbated by the use of tobacco, for example, being exacerbated by individuals who've experienced trauma. So when we begin to look at how do ACEs, specifically adverse childhood experiences, feed into substance use, we can see all these different factors here listed on the screen and how it can contribute to substance use in an individual's life. For example, it can lead to an earlier initiation of alcohol use for people who have high ACE scores or just experience ACEs in general. It also can be indicative of future problematic drinking behavior into adulthood, smoking, continued smoking into adulthood, lifetime illicit drug use, such as heroin and things of that nature, and self-reported addiction. The other one that may seem a little misplaced is the prescription drug use correlation. And I often point to that as an indicator of health or the absence of health. So what I mean by that, an individual that's on 5 prescriptions, we can reasonably infer that they're not as healthy as someone who does not have to use any prescriptions, for example, to manage illnesses. And so we can infer that people who are using more prescription drugs likely have a poor health conditions for various reasons. So again, ACEs being correlated to poor health outcomes. But just because we see these associations, it doesn't necessarily prove causation. So if we want to begin to think about how do we adequately address substance use, specifically in college students, we need to understand what is fueling, what part of trauma is fueling this likelihood to engage in substance use, this increased likelihood. Well, one of the areas that we can begin to look at to help answer that question is this idea of problematic drinking, or more specifically, binge drinking. And I'm sure all of you working on college campuses are intimately familiar with this problem. The statistic up here that I'll just throw up, in 2017, in terms of full-time college students, about 50% were current drinkers, with 34%, close to 35% being binge drinkers, and about 10% being heavy drinkers. And you can also see among full college students not enrolled full-time, those rates are also significantly high, but not as high as the full-time counterparts. And that could be due to a variety of reasons. So when we look at problematic drinking and compare it to this prevalence of trauma, another way to measure how common trauma may be in a population is by looking at the post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis, or PTSD. And we know in the general population, there's 8 to 9% of individuals that are experiencing PTSD in any given year, and that holds true or comparable to college students. But we also know of this thing called post-traumatic stress symptoms, or just post-traumatic stress. So this is stress due to potentially traumatizing events that doesn't meet the threshold to create a PTSD diagnosis, but that doesn't mean that those PTS symptoms are not distressing or fueling perhaps problematic drinking behavior. And so when you combine the PTSD prevalence with those subclinical indicators of PTSD, post-traumatic stress, you can get to up to 39% on the extreme end, or closer to 23 or 24% of individuals with these post-traumatic stress symptoms and or PTSD. And so I wonder what those individuals, if they're not in treatment, are engaging in to cope with those post-traumatic stress symptoms. One of the research articles I've looked at indicate that individuals who have PTS or PTSD are more likely to be engaged in problematic drinkers. We can very likely see that there's an intersection between students who are binge drinking and students who perhaps have PTSD and PTS. So in order to address some of the substance use issues we're seeing on college campuses, addressing the underlying trauma that may be fueling that, i.e. that emotional dysregulation due to trauma, becomes incredibly important. And how we do that, we're going to get to in just a few moments. But keeping with the theme of defining the 3 topics today, I want to quickly go over this idea of HIV. It's known as the human immunodeficiency virus, or the acronym being HIV, and it can be a debilitating disease when not treated properly, but with today's advances in technology, the outcomes are much, much better, and one can expect to live a full life when you're engaged in care. But nevertheless, it's a very unfortunate disease to be living with, and we know that the most common transmission modes and acquisition modes, so how I might acquire it, if, for example, if I were to acquire HIV, or if I was living with HIV, how might I transmit it? The 2 most common modes are sexual transmission, specifically vaginal and anal intercourse, as well as needle sharing. So, for example, people sharing needles who are using substance use. And so you might be wondering, well, where is the connection to trauma? We know that a high ACE score, a high level of early childhood adversity, can increase a likelihood to engage in what we call risky sexual behaviors, things such as multiple sexual partners at the same time, an increased likelihood to contract an STI, increased likelihood to engage in unprotected sex, all of which can increase the likelihood of acquiring HIV. And one of those mechanisms that may fuel HIV acquisition and transmission due to trauma is, again, this idea of emotional dysregulation, the damaged ability that individuals living with trauma experience to regulate their emotions. And then they turn to other means, such as substance use, to cope with the inability to modulate those emotions because they no longer have the physiological ability or cognitive ability due to the trauma to engage in that. And so again, it becomes really important. We also know from these other studies that various types of traumatic experiences are more strongly associated with HIV risk behaviors. So for both men and women, although this is just the female breakdown on the screen right now, but for both men and women, sexual abuse, you can see, has the strongest likelihood to engage in HIV risk behaviors. So the odds are 2.9 higher for individuals who've experienced sexual abuse versus those who have not to engage in those HIV risk behaviors that I mentioned before, sharing needles and among other risk factors. And then you can go down the list and see that the type of trauma can also indicate the greatest likelihood or the greatest odds of engaging in those risk behaviors. So as I said, sexual abuse is the same for men and women, but there is a difference as you go down the line between men and women. So this screen here is the female types of abuse and odds ratio, and here is the male. And you can see it's a little bit different. I'll go ahead and flip through those again. Sexual abuse being top for men and women, but then interpersonal violence and lived with a substance abuser as the next two for males, but for females, verbal abuse comes in third, and the breakdown is different. So the takeaway here is that not only can adversity in general increase the likelihood to engage in these HIV risk behaviors, but also it can vary by men and women. So being mindful of that becomes really important. Another important thing to mention as I flip through these next slides is that the most impacted population is often in terms of HIV prevalence rates and new acquisitions and transmissions, is among what the Illinois Department of Public Health defines as men who have sex with men, or MSM. So you can see HIV prevention strategies being incredibly important for the MSM population, or those who oftentimes identify within the LGBTQ category. So having this as a component and understanding how trauma can feed into substance use and how substance use can feed into risky sexual behaviors and trauma into risky sexual behaviors, then piling risk upon risk to create the greatest likelihood for HIV transmission and acquisition if those individuals encounter someone living with HIV. And so it becomes really important. I'm hoping you're beginning to glean from the title that trauma can lead to all these various things, and that the key to addressing substance use, HIV, a key component of our prevention and treatment strategies has to be addressing trauma. This other slide here just demonstrates that also the higher number of ACEs right here. So if you have one ACE, for example, you have a 1.94 higher odds of engaging in HIV risk behaviors. And as the number of ACEs go up, so 4 or plus, so do the odds for engaging in HIV risk behaviors. But you'll see here, the male odds are different from the female odds. So there's a stronger connection between number of ACEs and likelihood to engage in HIV risk behaviors for men compared to women as well. Again, reinforcing this emotional regulation component and also connecting the trauma and substance use to the HIV epidemic. I have a few quotes here regarding this research article I've come across. And we know that these, as the quote says, these experiences of trauma and the enacted stigma, particularly with the men who have sex with men population, or the MSM population, often identifying in the LGBTQ categories, that they experience across the lifespan may result in difficulties with emotional regulation. So those traumatic experiences making it more difficult to regulate their emotions. And that in turn can lead to some of these clinically compulsive sexual behaviors and difficult to control sexual urges that could manifest themselves in HIV risk behaviors and lead to a greater HIV acquisition and transmission. And I want to stress here that there currently is not a DSM-5, a Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Health Disorders definition, or diagnosis rather, for sexual compulsivity, although it was close to being included. So there's that disclaimer. And I also want to say that this idea of sexual compulsivity is not the same as people who happen to have a lot of sex, right? So I don't want to stigmatize people who potentially engage in frequent sexual activity. This is more about people who are having sexual thoughts that they feel are difficult to control, or urges they feel like they are unable to control or have a compulsion to act on. And so there's a big difference, and we have to be careful not to create stigma around this topic. And so the authors in this research indicated that the difficulties with emotional regulation may be the important antecedents to that sexual compulsivity. So the emotional dysregulation coming before the difficulty with sexual compulsivity, which can lead to trauma, or excuse me, HIV diagnosis. And how substance use fits in here, they also found in this study that people who have the sexual compulsivity often turn to substance use to cope with those sexual thoughts. So treating these sexual compulsivity in the individuals that it's manifesting itself in could be important to eliminating the need for that coping mechanism if that happens to be substance use. And interestingly enough, the sexual compulsivity isn't necessarily what leads people to engage in those HIV risk behaviors, but rather coping with the substances, such as alcohol, which increase sexual desire, then increases their likelihood to engage in risky sexual behaviors. So if you take anything away from this slide, it's that the connections between trauma, HIV, substance use, emotional dysregulation are very complicated and multifaceted, but at the core is addressing that emotional dysregulation that can occur in people living with trauma. Checking my time here. So you can see here that perhaps the paradigm should be for HIV prevention and intervention efforts, but also for substance use interventions and efforts should be perhaps focused on those, the highest priority for intervention should be focused on those who are most traumatized, i.e. those who are most impacted by these traumas that lead to emotional dysregulation, which could in turn turn into using alcohol or other substances as coping mechanisms to deal with these untreated post-traumatic stress symptoms. And so perhaps our prevention and intervention paradigm needs to shift a little bit now that we put on our trauma-informed lens to see this problem in a new light. So what do we do about it? I hope I've laid this foundation that you begin to understand the importance of addressing trauma, psychological trauma in its various forms. In my other daytime life, I provide 3-hour workshops that define trauma more clearly, because you may still have questions about what exactly it qualifies as. So I encourage you to seek out additional training on this idea of trauma. But once you understand how trauma can feed into substance use and aggressive behaviors that manifest themselves in the forms of individual and community violence, then we can begin to see that we need to address the trauma. And we can do that through trauma-informed approaches, trauma-informed interventions, and trauma-informed care, which I oftentimes use interchangeably or just collectively referred to as trauma-informed approaches. So it's important to recognize that becoming trauma-informed can occur on an individual level, as a person, as an individual, but it can also occur on a systems level. So an entire higher education institution, for example, could be a system that is engaging in becoming trauma-informed. So every aspect of that organization, not just the teachers being trained, not just the administrative staff, but also the cooks, the support staff, the facilities management, all these different people being trained in recognizing what trauma is, how it manifests itself in themselves and the people that they're working with, and what can we do organizationally in terms of policies, procedures, and processes to better respond to the various manifestations that trauma may have within our system. Oftentimes, most probably in that context, mostly be seen through the students. You know, for example, a teacher might look at a student that generally performs incredibly well in a class, and all of a sudden their grades dip. Maybe it was that they didn't care about the assignment, or maybe it's because they're going through something that's very stressful that may be inducing trauma. And the beauty of the trauma-informed approaches is that it can be helpful for people who are traumatized. It can be helpful for people who just have post-traumatic stress, and it can be helpful for people who have none of the above. These are universal approaches that can be applied to entire populations without any harm. Kind of think of vaccinations, for example, and herd immunity in terms of trauma-informed approaches. So what is it? A trauma-informed approach realizes the widespread impact of ACEs, for example, or trauma, and how individuals who are living with trauma can engage in the process of healing and recovering. A trauma-informed approach would equip people in a system or as an individual to recognize what those signs and symptoms are. So students who perhaps are withdrawn, or students who are highly aggressive, maybe manifesting itself in school violence, is that what's fueling those symptoms? And in fact, it could be their traumatic experiences that have created this emotional dysregulation. A trauma-informed approach also responds by fully integrating this knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices and processes, as I had mentioned. And then finally, this is an important one, as professionals potentially engaging with students who may be living with trauma, it becomes really important to be mindful of the things that we can inadvertently do that can be re-traumatizing for the students that are entrusted in your care. And so understanding what re-traumatization is and what are the things that people could be doing with good intentions, perhaps, that could re-traumatize individuals, make them relive those experiences, for example. So getting to more specifics, there's a beautiful guide online that I found that you can access at this link here listed on the screen. And so these PowerPoint slides will be made available at the end today's presentation. You're also welcome to email me if you need a copy, which I'll provide my email address later. So I encourage you to delve deeper into that guide, but I just was going to throw up these 4 principles to get us started thinking about what this might look like in terms of a campus level strategy. So these 4 principles here are for working with trauma affected or traumatized or people living with trauma within the community that in question, in this case, a campus. So it becomes really important to normalize and validate their feelings and experiences. So what does that mean? We know that people who have experienced trauma have dealt with something that they have perceived to be life-threatening, to be overwhelming to their bodily, emotionally, and physiologically, psychologically experience that they are unable to deal with effectively. And so in other words, they're shifting to this survival mindset. What can I do to survive this event that is overwhelming and that feels like it's beyond my ability to deal with? And so what they do, they develop what we may see as maladaptive coping mechanisms, so substance use, or you might see aggressive individuals who had to engage in aggression to protect themselves, perhaps in an abuseful home environment. And we see those as negative things, as bad things, but what they really are is that person's best attempt, best try at trying to survive. So recognizing that they are not socially acceptable approaches, but they are their experience and they are what they had to do to survive. And there's a strength in that they were able to use those skills, whatever skills they have, to survive. But as teachers, as people being trauma informed, we can begin to affirm that they did what they had to do to survive. But at the same time, here are some other coping strategies that will help them become more successful and build on the strengths that they have to be more successful in their environment. So normalizing and validating what has happened to them. It's not their fault, but they did the best they could to survive, right? Number 2 is to assist them in understanding the past and its emotional impact. So I think everyone on this call has lived long enough to know that our past shapes our future, or at the very least, it informs our future. And just as past experiences can help us understand how to respond to different situations, there's also the emotional residue that our past experience has on us. So past experience can impact our ability to trust people, It can impact our ability to relate to people. And so maybe you'll have students in a classroom that don't know how to relate, or the only way they can relate at parties, for example, is drinking or doing what is socially accepted in that moment as a way to integrate themselves into what's a foreign environment. So recognizing and help them recognize how the trauma may be manifesting itself in their day-to-day life. And there's a lot of different ways to do this, which I'll talk about very briefly, but I encourage you to check out the guide to understand each of these points in more detail. Again, empowering them to better manage their current lives to different interventions an institution may be able to offer its students, like the counseling center that so many campuses have, which is a great resource, and focusing on their strengths and helping them build on their strengths to manage any weaknesses they may have and to forge a path forward, rather than creating negative frames and focusing on what they're not doing. Instead, build on what they are doing. You are a survivor. You made it through this experience. What can I do to help you forge a path forward and build on that skill set you've developed, as an example? And then help them understand challenges in light of the past victimization. So the things that have happened to them have created unfair challenges that they are now facing, but the reality is it is the life that they're facing, and what can I do to help them forge through this on a campus level? So these maybe aren't questions on an individual level that all teachers would ask them, but they could be. More importantly, it's what can we do from a systematic perspective as a higher ed institution to begin integrating these principles of trauma-informed care into our educational system. But I recognize you probably didn't sign up for this webinar to change an entire organizational system. It's very difficult work. So there's a lot of smaller, more practical strategies that you can use as well, which I'll mention in terms of some programmatic activities that a campus could engage in. But these are some great strategies for teachers. Excuse me. In that guide that I mentioned here on this previous slide, you can also see these 6 principles, and they're described in more detail. So that could be a great handout to share with teachers or college professors, for example. So always empowering students, as I said before, focusing on their strengths and how can you use those strengths to help build them up and help them believe, self-efficacy, that they can traverse through these difficult and challenging times they may be facing. Expressing that unconditional positive regard. So recognizing that every student's inherent worth and dignity exist, and that whether or not they turn an assignment or not does not diminish their value as a person, for example. And that's followed up with point number 3, maintaining those high expectations and being consistent about those. Oftentimes, individuals who've experienced trauma come from very unstable home environments or just unstable conditions in general in life, in terms of perhaps unemployment or high poverty, not knowing when the next meal is going to come from or where the next paycheck is going to come from. So you can have those high expectations, but also helping them help build self-efficacy to help these students believe that they can meet those expectations, and empowering them to equip them to rise to those challenges. Also being sure to have a high level of self-awareness within ourselves. So what assumptions are we making about students? What behaviors are we observing in students, and what could be fueling those behaviors? And so that's the questioning piece, always asking ourselves, what am I assuming? And are my assumptions facts? What am I observing, and what could be feeding into that, and what can I do about that? And so again, it's putting on these trauma-informed glasses, this trauma-informed lens, to begin to see student behavior in the context of the trauma they may have experienced. And in the same way with something like binge drinking, what is it that students have gone through that perhaps could drive them to binge drink as a coping mechanism, for example? So be a relationship coach. And I think for me, or in a few words, I would just describe that as modeling the behaviors and the expectations that you have for your students. And also how you would engage students. So if you want students to be diplomatic in discussions, then make sure you're diplomatic with them in terms of your student-teacher interactions. And then also being sure to provide guided opportunities for helpful participation. So another word of saying this for people who have engaged in elementary, middle school, or high school education is this idea of scaffolding. So giving them the tools and layers and helping them build up to opportunities that they can feel like they're being participatory in the environment, but making it, facilitating that process so it's as smooth as possible for people who may not have the social and emotional skill sets that their counterparts have due to the trauma they've experienced. In terms of a very a great intervention, programmatically, something that a college could do, is this idea of mindfulness. Here in Minnesota, at the University of Minnesota, there is a developmental child psychologist who has done research on how mindfulness can help promote executive functioning in younger populations. And so, excuse me, what do I mean by executive functioning? Oftentimes, executive functioning, rather, is that attention to the task at hand, that mental flexibility, being able to apply complex set of rules to different situations, being able to problem solve, for example. And we know that when trauma occurs and creates this emotional dysregulation, that a person who's not properly emotionally regulated never has the ability to develop these executive functioning skills, attention, mental flexibility, problem solving, that are so integral to the college experience. So by integrating mindfulness perhaps into the classroom or into campus opportunities for students, they can begin to help modulate their emotions through these mindfulness practices and also potentially help increase their self-awareness, which could enhance executive functioning skills, which are essential to the learning environment. So I have no vested interest in this particular mindfulness curriculum or mindfulness approach, but it is one that I found online, and I'm seeing that the Wellness Center or the Wellness something at Harvard uses this mindfulness, and there's a research article to back this up, a specific intervention for college students. So that's why I'm sharing this one, but know that mindfulness in general is a very valuable tool for self-regulation, to address the emotional dysregulation, and to increase executive functioning, which is integral to the learning experience. So there's a lot of different ways that you could work on this, and there could be a whole workshop on mindfulness, but I wanted to introduce you to this as a resource, but being mindful that many others exist. Another intervention to help address substance use in college populations while at the same time addressing some of the effects of trauma is this seeking safety, which is an evidence-based counseling model. And the wonderful thing about this is that you don't have to be a licensed clinical provider to utilize this seeking safety model. Really, quite literally, anyone can utilize it, because what it does not do is specifically address the substance use, for example, in an intensive inpatient addiction therapy, nor does it delve into what we call the trauma narrative. So you're not asking people who would come to seeking safety to talk about their traumatic experiences necessarily. What this does do is build these very foundational skills and senses to help adequately deal with the residual effects of trauma as it manifests itself in substance use and their social life, for example. So these key principles of seeking safety, establishing that safety, or helping clients feel safe in their relationships, their thinking, their behavior, emotions. This being important because in traumatized populations, their safety was often compromised in those scenarios, those trauma scenarios. It's also that integrated component, working on both trauma and substance use at the same time. It focuses on the ideals to counteract with the loss of ideals that happen with both trauma and substance use. So that might be along the lines of expectations. And then it has these 4 content areas which focus on cognitive processes, the behavioral manifestations, interpersonal, how to have good relationships, and case management. And then finally, attention to clinician processes. So this would be like, for example, how a teacher presents their emotional response to a student could be triggering for that student. So if a teacher takes on an aggressive pose, or if a teacher is visibly distressed, people who are traumatized might mirror those emotions or might respond in a less helpful way because of the emotional modulating abilities of those teachers. So being mindful of your own emotional expressions becomes important too, and this attends to that. It's evidence-based, which is what this slide demonstrates for adults. in terms of the substance abuse treatment and trauma treatment component. So I did email this organization to see that the Seeking Safety website to see if they had done a specific study for college students, and they had said no, but I would point that adult includes anyone that's 18 plus, which would include the college age population. And so I would still say it's a relevant resource. And there's a link down here at the bottom of this page to learn more about it. The other thing to keep in mind is I don't know what your experience, and I'm not intimately familiar with this idea of basics or brief alcohol screening and intervention for college students. I know they sometimes refer a newer acronym as SBIRT, I believe, screening intervention, or what is it? SBIRT, screening, brief intervention and referral to treatment programs. And so what we're finding is that these are valuable tools, but in people who have post-traumatic stress or PTSD or have been traumatized, that focusing on some other dimensions becomes really important, or the approach with basics or SBIRT should be slightly different for people who are living with trauma, or you could enhance the effectiveness of those brief interventions if you focus on these other areas. So again, there's a research article that talks more explicitly than what I will about these different areas. If you email me, I'm happy to send you a link to that article. But in general, there's two areas that could benefit from focusing on in terms of PTS individuals or traumatized individuals, and that's cognitions and behaviors. For cognitions, I'm focusing on self-efficacy, so building within the person in question the idea that they can be successful, and making sure that they know that they have the ability to succeed when in the past, perhaps due to trauma, they feel like they have been unable to do so. So building that becomes an important component. Expectancies is also something that needs to be paid attention to, and I'm blanking on my notes for that bullet point, but I can share that article if you'd like to learn more. In terms of behaviors, coping strategies, they're finding that that oftentimes recognizing how post-traumatic stress and managing the negative emotional responses that are associated with post-traumatic stress, people will turn to substance use to do that. So taking away a person's coping mechanism without helping them replace it with positive coping mechanisms is probably not the best thing to do. And that feeds into the next point of emotional regulation skills. An individual who's experienced trauma, who perhaps has emotional dysregulation, is physiologically not as well equipped to modulate those difficult emotions. And so as a way to I don't know if I'd say avoid, but as a way to cope with those emotions, they turn to alcohol, potentially could turn to alcohol. And so giving them the skills to emotionally regulate, perhaps through mindfulness, as an example, would be really important as well to increase the effectiveness of a brief intervention. And then finally, there's a lot of different, I think there was 3 different protective factors talked about in this article, but the one that becomes most important, it sounded like, or most helpful for post-traumatic stress individuals, people living with PTS, is the idea of a buddy system, so that indirect social support. And so for a person engaged in a brief intervention, making sure they have a buddy when they go out to help hold them accountable, for example, might be the most effective strategy for them versus other protective factors like pacing your drinks, etc. So all these are important components that need to be considered when you're thinking about basics or SBIRT for brief intervention for binge drinkers or college campuses, recognizing that we know many binge drinkers and people with problematic drinking habits more than likely have experienced trauma to a greater or lesser extent. So here's some more resources that I have compiled. If you'd like to learn more about some of these acronyms I'm throwing out, or you may already be more familiar than me. There's that article I mentioned that talks about, that I talked about on the previous slide. So you can click on that link if you want to learn more, dig more into the cognitive and behavioral dimensions that should be attended to for binge drinkers among college students specifically, to help make that brief intervention more effective. There's another resource here for more information about that basics, brief alcohol screening and intervention for college students information. Also the SBIRT, screening, brief intervention, referral to treatment white paper that talks about that, and then also a toolkit for screening and brief intervention for college and university campuses. All great resources to consider looking at. If you're thinking about a system level change to become more trauma informed, these two guides put out by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration are free, and I recommend them. Even though this TIP 57 or Treatment Improvement Protocol 57 is billed there on the front cover as behavioral health services, I think the concepts are applicable to any institution. So whether that be behavioral health, mental health, substance use, or even an office space, a college, healthcare, for example, I think this is applicable to a greater or lesser extent. Obviously, in an office setting, you're not providing treatment for behavioral health issues in terms of just a corporate environment, but you can be mindful, for example, of destructive leadership and how that could be traumatizing for individuals, or the effect it could have on people who are living with trauma. So you can really take this trauma-informed lens and apply it anywhere, and this book's a great resource to do that. So you get a free copy online. It's pretty lengthy, but you can get it free online, or you can order one from Amazon if you want a hard copy. And this tip 59 is great because a big part of being trauma-informed is also being culturally competent, or some people prefer culturally humble. So recognizing that there's a lot to know about other people's cultures and that you'll likely never learn all of it, but being mindful that there's things that people bring from their cultures that can influence treatment and how someone might present themselves in a situation. So great free resources to check out. Again, I was hoping to leave you with some action steps, some things to help you find more information if you have more questions. And so these are more resources I hope that you will find useful. This top one is for organizations, specifically healthcare organizations that are looking to become trauma informed. But as I said, these resources are applicable across systems, I think, in a lot of different contexts. So I encourage you to check that out. This next one, the NASDAD Trauma Informed Approaches Toolkit, is geared more towards HIV and hepatitis B type areas of prevention in terms of being trauma informed. But again, it's applicable across systems, and it's a great resource to consider. And again, I'm just putting in another plug for this trauma-informed practices, which may be most relevant for post-secondary education, this guide here that you can dig more into if you want to learn more about those campus and classrooms trauma-informed strategies that I mentioned in the previous slide. So as we get ready for questions, and I'm looking over here at the time, and I think I'm ending at a good spot for questions, I want you to think about all that was covered. I'm sure your mind might be a little numb because it was a lot to take in. But if you take away one thing today, I want to reinforce this idea that we need to put on our trauma-informed lens, our trauma-informed glasses, if we want to begin to see what society is really facing. And so I'd say, is society facing this heroin epidemic or this opioid epidemic we hear about? Is it facing the various chronic diseases that we're hearing about, obesity, etc.? Are we facing an HIV epidemic or a substance use epidemic in terms of alcoholism, tobacco use? Or what are we really facing when we put on our trauma-informed lens is a trauma epidemic? And that this, while it's not as simple to say everything's caused by trauma, could trauma be a very important factor that is threaded through so many of the different things that we're trying to fix in the world today? And so with that those trauma-informed glasses that I'm leaving with you here today, I would hope that you would begin to relook at some of the issues and some of the challenges you're facing in your life or in your professional work sphere, for example, i.e. problematic student behavior, and see, is this student acting out? Are they trying to be difficult? Or could some of the biological, the psychological mechanisms or maladaptive processes that people who are living with trauma have acquired, could those be feeding into the behaviors? And what can we do to address trauma versus calling out this specific behavior that could just be a coping or a survival mechanism that they learned that is no longer helpful for their current environment in the school system? So with that, I thank you for listening. I hope this presentation has been helpful for you. And I encourage you to reach out by telephone listed there on the screen or at my email addresses, or if you have any question about the references, I'm happy to provide details. And at this time, I'll invite Grace to moderate any questions, and Aisha, any questions that people may have today.
Thank you so much, Nick. That was very informative, and I appreciate your taking time to do this for us. Um, do we have any questions for Nick at this time? I haven't gotten any in the question box, but that doesn't mean um, that we don't have any. We'll kind of open it up and make it so that you guys can just kind of ask the questions verbally and just unmute yourself, and we'll go ahead and open it up for a few minutes.
And why people are thinking about questions, it might be also interesting to hear any people currently working in higher ed that have some experience engaging in trauma-informed approaches, and if there's anything that they've done that might be helpful for other people on the call today to hear as another consideration or something to consider for their own institution of higher ed.
That's a great idea, Nick. Can we hear from some of the participants? It seems like the weather around here has got people kind of quiet today. Um,
That's understandable. It's pretty frigid up here in
it,
Minnesota. 7 degrees this morning.
oh my goodness, yeah, we're pretty cold here too, in the low 20s. But you definitely beat us on coldness for sure. Um, we'll give it just a minute more. If not, then we do have your information here on the screen, and I would like to let everybody know that these are recorded, so we are going to post these on our website under this training. You just go to the IHEC website and you can kind of review his materials and listen to this again if you'd like to. If you weren't able to stay for the whole thing, or if you just want to kind of listen, get some more resources or write them down from what he had left for us, or contact him even directly. So we'll give it just a minute more and see if we get any questions or anything. And then if not, then I thank you for presenting for us and sharing your information.
Yeah, no problem. I appreciate the opportunity, and I always like to thank everyone as well for taking the time to listen to me. So I hope this was valuable for you, and I do encourage you to reach out with any other questions that you might like to ask offline as well.
All right. I'm just going to go ahead and close. Hopefully, everybody can maybe develop some questions on email and kind of talk to you, you know, off of here. You seem like you're a wealth of knowledge, and we really appreciate you coming and sharing with us.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. Everybody have a wonderful rest of your day.